The rain drummed against the tall windows of Buckingham Palace as 10-year-old Prince George walked slowly through the grand corridors. His small footsteps echoed on the polished marble floors, creating a lonely sound that seemed to follow him everywhere he went. Today felt different from all the other days, though he couldn't quite understand why. Outside the palace gates, thousands of people had gathered since early morning. They held flowers, cards, and small gifts, all hoping to catch a glimpse of the young prince. The crowd had been growing larger each day, and the security team was on high alert. But George didn't know about the crowds or the security concerns. He only knew that something was bothering him deep inside his heart. As he rounded the corner near the main entrance, George spotted Sergeant Williams standing perfectly still at his post. The guard had been working at the palace for 15 years, and George had seen him countless times before. Sergeant Williams always stood like a statue, never moving, never speaking, just watching over everything with his sharp eyes. His red uniform was always perfectly pressed, his black boots shined to perfection, and his tall black hat sat exactly right on his head. But today, as George looked at the guard more carefully, he noticed something he had never seen before. There were tiny drops of water on Sergeant Williams's cheeks, and they weren't from the rain. The guard was crying very quietly, trying his best to hide it while still doing his duty. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped his rifle, and his usually straight shoulders seemed to carry an invisible weight. George stopped walking and stared at the guard for a long moment. In all his young life, he had never seen a grown-up cry while trying to work. It made him feel strange and worried. The prince had been taught many things about royal protocol and proper behavior, but no one had ever taught him what to do when he saw someone in pain. The young prince looked around the empty hallway, making sure no one else was watching. Then he took a small step closer to Sergeant Williams. The guard noticed the movement but kept his eyes straight ahead as he was trained to do. His job was to protect and watch, not to interact with the royal family unless there was danger. George could see that the guard was trying very hard not to let anyone know he was upset. The tears kept coming, but Sergeant Williams wiped them away quickly whenever he thought no one was looking. His breathing was a little uneven, and he blinked more than usual, fighting against whatever was making him so sad. The prince felt his own heart start to beat faster. He had learned about duty and responsibility from his parents and teachers, but he had also learned about kindness and caring from his grandmother before she passed away. She had always told him that being royal meant helping others, especially when they needed it most. As George stood there watching, he remembered a conversation he had overheard between his parents just a few days ago. They had been talking about how difficult it was for the palace staff to do their jobs while dealing with their own personal problems. His mother had said something about how the guards and servants often had to hide their feelings and put duty before their own needs. Now, seeing Sergeant Williams struggling to maintain his composure while clearly going through something difficult, George began to understand what his mother had meant. The guard couldn't leave his post, couldn't show emotion, couldn't ask for help. He had to stand there and suffer in silence while protecting others. The rain outside grew heavier and the sound echoed through the palace halls. George could hear the distant voices of tourists and reporters outside the gates, all hoping for a story or a photograph. But inside these walls, in this quiet corridor, there was just a young prince and a hurting guard, connected by a moment of unexpected understanding. George took another step forward, his mind racing with thoughts about what the right thing to do might be. He had been taught to follow rules and maintain proper distance from the staff, but his heart was telling him something completely different. Every instinct he had was urging him to do something, anything, to help ease the pain he could see in Sergeant Williams' face. The guard's tears continued to fall, and George realized that this moment would change everything. George's mind raced as he tried to think of what to do next. He had never been in a situation like this before, where the rules he had been taught seemed to conflict with what his heart was telling him to do. The young prince knew that guards weren't supposed to talk to royal family members unless spoken to first, and even then, conversations were supposed to be brief and formal. But as he watched Sergeant Williams struggle to control his emotions, George realized that sometimes the most important things couldn't be found in rule books or royal protocols. The guard's pain was real, and it was happening right in front of him. George couldn't just walk away and pretend he hadn't seen it. Taking a deep breath, the prince made a decision that would surprise everyone, including himself. He walked directly up to Sergeant Williams and stood right beside him. The guard's eyes widened slightly in surprise, but he remained at attention, unsure of what to do. This had never happened before in his 15 years of service. "Sir," George said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Are you okay?" Sergeant Williams blinked rapidly, trying to process what was happening. The young prince was speaking to him directly, asking about his well-being and showing genuine concern. For a moment, the guard forgot about his training and looked down at the boy standing beside him. "Your Highness," Sergeant Williams replied, his voice shaky. "I'm fine, sir. Just doing my duty." But George could see that the guard was not fine at all. The tears were still there and his hands were still trembling slightly. The prince had always been observant, a trait that served him well in his studies, and now it was helping him see past the formal responses to the real person underneath the uniform. "You don't look fine," George said gently. "You look sad. Really sad." The honesty in the young prince's voice caught Sergeant Williams off guard. He had expected a royal child to be distant and formal, but George was speaking to him like a real person, with real feelings. It was more compassion than he had experienced from anyone in weeks. The guard glanced around nervously, making sure no other staff members or family members were nearby. He knew that this conversation could get him into serious trouble, but something about the prince's genuine concern made it impossible to maintain his usual professional distance. My daughter is very sick, Your Highness," Sergeant Williams admitted quietly. "She's in the hospital, and I haven't been able to see her for 3 days because of my duty schedule. I'm supposed to be strong, but—" His voice trailed off as more tears began to fall. George felt his own eyes begin to water as he listened to the guard's story. The prince couldn't imagine being separated from his own family when someone he loved was sick and needed him. "That must be very scary," George said, his young voice filled with understanding. "How old is your daughter?" "She's 8, sir. Just 2 years younger than you. Her name is Emma, and she loves drawing and reading stories about princesses." Sergeant Williams smiled through his tears as he talked about his daughter. "She always asks me to tell her about working at the palace, and she dreams of meeting a real prince someday." George's heart nearly broke hearing about little Emma. He thought about his own sister and how worried he would be if she were in the hospital. He imagined Emma lying in a hospital bed, wondering why her father couldn't come to see her, not understanding that duty was keeping him away. "She sounds wonderful," George said sincerely. "I bet she misses you a lot right now." Sergeant Williams nodded, unable to speak for a moment. The kindness in the young prince's voice was overwhelming. Here was a member of the royal family, someone who could have anything in the world, taking time to care about his personal problems. George stood quietly beside the guard for several minutes, both of them lost in their own thoughts. The rain continued to fall outside, and the palace remained busy with its daily activities. But in this small corner of the grand building, 2 people had found an unexpected connection. The prince began to form an idea, something that went against everything he had been taught about proper royal behavior. But as he looked at Sergeant Williams's pain-filled face, George knew that sometimes doing the right thing meant breaking the rules. As George stood beside Sergeant Williams, his mind began working on a plan that seemed both simple and impossible at the same time. He had an idea that could help the guard see his sick daughter, but it would require him to do something no prince had ever done before in the history of the palace. "Sergeant Williams," George said carefully, "what if someone else could watch your post for a little while? What if you could go see Emma today?" The guard looked down at the prince with surprise and sadness. "That's very kind of you to think about, Your Highness, but it doesn't work that way. I have my orders, and I can't leave my post unless I'm officially relieved by another guard. And all the other guards are busy with their own duties." George nodded thoughtfully. He understood about duty and responsibility, but he also understood about love and family. His grandmother had always told him that the most important job of any person, royal or not, was to take care of the people they loved. "What if a member of the royal family ordered you to go?" George asked quietly. Sergeant Williams looked confused. "Well, yes, Your Highness. If I received a direct order from a senior royal family member, I would have to follow it. But I don't think—" "And what if someone else volunteered to watch your post while you were gone?" George continued, his plan becoming clearer in his mind. "That would be very unusual, sir. The person would need to understand the importance of the position and be trustworthy enough to handle the responsibility." Sergeant Williams paused, still not understanding where the conversation was leading. But I don't know who would be willing or able to do such a thing. George took a deep breath and looked directly at the guard. I would. The words hung in the air between them like something magical and impossible. Sergeant Williams stared at the young prince, certain he had misheard. I'm sorry, Your Highness. But did you say, I said I would watch your post, George repeated, his voice growing stronger with conviction. I would stand guard so you could go see Emma. I know it's never been done before, but that doesn't mean it can't be done. Sergeant Williams felt his knees go weak. The idea was so unexpected, so unprecedented, that he couldn't even process it properly. A member of the royal family offering to take over a guard's duties was unheard of. It went against centuries of tradition and protocol. Your Highness, That's incredibly generous, but it's impossible. You're a prince. You can't stand guard duty. Your parents would never allow it, and the security team would be horrified. It's just not done. But George had already made up his mind. He could see the love and desperation in Sergeant Williams' eyes, and he knew that sometimes the most important things in life required breaking a few rules. My grandmother always told me that being royal means serving others. Not the other way around, George said with the wisdom that sometimes comes from the mouths of children. She said that our titles and privileges should be used to help people, especially when they need it most. The guard felt fresh tears coming to his eyes, but this time they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of amazement and gratitude. He had never met anyone, royal or common, who was willing to sacrifice their position and comfort to help someone they barely knew. But Your Highness, even if you're serious about this, I don't know how it could work. There are procedures, protocols, security concerns. George smiled, and for the first time since their conversation began, he looked exactly like the confident young prince he was born to be. Leave that to me. I know exactly what to do. The determination in George's voice surprised them both. The prince had inherited his mother's compassionate heart and his father's strong will, and when those two qualities combined, they created a force that could move mountains, or in this case, change centuries-old palace traditions. What about your parents? Sergeant Williams asked, still unable to believe what was happening. What will they say when they find out what you're planning? George paused for a moment, thinking about his parents and their reaction to his plan. Then he smiled again, remembering all the lessons they had taught him about kindness, responsibility, and doing what was right. They taught me to help people when they need it, George said simply. I think they'll understand. George left Sergeant Williams at his post and walked quickly through the palace corridors, his mind focused on the mission ahead. He needed to find his father and explain his plan, knowing that it would either be the most brilliant idea he'd ever had or the most trouble he'd ever gotten into. He found Prince William in his private study, reviewing official documents and preparing for an upcoming meeting with government officials. The room was filled with the quiet authority that always surrounded his father when he was working on important matters of state. Father, George said, knocking gently on the open door. May I speak with you about something very important? Prince William looked up from his papers and smiled at his son. Of course, George, come in. You look very serious about something. George walked into the study and stood in front of his father's desk, gathering his courage. He knew that what he was about to propose would sound crazy, but he also knew that his father had always taught him to stand up for what was right. There's a guard named Sergeant Williams who has been crying at his post. George began carefully. His 8-year-old daughter Emma is very sick in the hospital, and he hasn't been able to see her for 3 days because he can't leave his duty. Prince William's expression grew concerned. The welfare of palace staff was something he and Catherine took very seriously, and hearing about a sick child always touched his heart deeply. That's terrible, George. We should definitely make sure he gets time to see his daughter. I'll speak with the security chief about arranging coverage for his post. Actually, Father, I have a different idea, George said, his voice growing stronger. I want to stand guard in his place so he can go to the hospital today. The silence in the room was complete. Prince William stared at his son, certain he had misunderstood what George had just proposed. I'm sorry, what did you say? I want to take over his guard duty so Sergeant Williams can go see Emma. I know it's never been done before, but I've been thinking about it, and I don't see why it couldn't work. Prince William set down his papers and leaned back in his chair, studying his son's face. He could see that George was completely serious about his proposal, and the determination in the young prince's eyes reminded him of his own mother's unwavering commitment to helping others. George, I admire your compassion, and your desire to help Sergeant Williams is wonderful. But what you're suggesting is, Prince William paused, searching for the right words. It's unprecedented. Members of the royal family don't stand guard duty. Why not? George asked simply. I mean, really, why not? I'm old enough, I'm responsible, and I understand how important the job is. Sergeant Williams could teach me what to do, and I could handle it for a few hours. Prince William found himself in the unusual position of not having a good answer to his son's question. The truth was, there was no real reason why George couldn't stand guard, other than tradition and protocol. And those had never been good enough reasons to prevent helping someone in need. George, even if I agreed to this plan, which I'm not saying I am, there would be security concerns, protocol issues, and, Father, George interrupted gently, didn't you always teach me that our privileges come with responsibilities? And that the most important responsibility is to help people when they need help? Prince William felt a surge of pride mixed with concern as he looked at his son. George had clearly inherited the family's strong sense of duty and compassion, but he was also proposing something that could cause significant complications. What exactly are you proposing? Prince William asked, deciding to hear the full plan before making any decisions. George's face lit up with excitement as he realized his father was actually considering the idea. Sergeant Williams could quickly teach me the basics of standing guard. I would wear a smaller version of the uniform, stand at his post for 3 or 4 hours and make sure everything stays safe and secure. Meanwhile, he could go to the hospital, see Emma, and come back feeling much better. And you think you could handle that responsibility? Prince William asked, his voice serious. Yes, sir. I know I can. I've watched the guards many times and I understand what they do. Plus, there are other security people around the palace, so I wouldn't really be alone. Prince William stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the palace grounds where several guards were visible at their posts. He thought about his own childhood, his mother's teachings about service, and the values he and Catherine were trying to instill in their children. After several long minutes of silence, Prince William turned back to his son. If we were to do this, and I'm saying if, there would be conditions. Serious conditions, George nodded eagerly, sensing that his father was warming to the idea. You would have to be completely professional, follow every instruction Sergeant Williams gives you, and understand that this is real responsibility, not a game. I understand, Father. This isn't a game. This is about helping Emma and her father. Prince William made several phone calls over the next 30 minutes, speaking with security chiefs, protocol officers, and even Catherine about George's unusual request. Each conversation was met with initial shock, followed by careful consideration of how such an unprecedented event could be managed safely. Meanwhile, George waited nervously in his father's study, hoping that the adults would find a way to make his plan work. He kept thinking about Sergeant Williams standing at his post, still crying quietly, still worried about his daughter Emma lying alone in a hospital bed. Finally, Prince William hung up the phone after his last call and turned to face his son. George, what you're asking to do is extraordinary, and it goes against centuries of royal tradition. But after speaking with everyone involved, we've found a way to make it work safely. George's heart leaped with joy and relief. Really, we can do it? Yes, but with very strict conditions, Prince William said seriously. First, you'll be given a modified uniform that fits properly. Second, Sergeant Williams will spend an hour training you on exactly what to do and what to watch for. Third, there will be additional security positioned nearby, though they'll stay out of sight so you can have the full experience of the responsibility. I understand, Father. What else? Fourth, you'll only stand guard for 3 hours maximum, which should give Sergeant Williams enough time to visit his daughter and return. And finally, if anything unusual happens, anything at all, you're to immediately signal for the backup security. George nodded solemnly at each condition, understanding that his father was taking a significant risk by allowing this to happen. I promise I'll follow every rule and be completely professional. There's one more thing, George, Prince William added, his voice soft with emotion. What you're doing today will likely be remembered for a very long time. People will talk about the day a prince stood guard so a father could see his sick child. Are you ready for that kind of attention? George thought for a moment about the crowds outside the palace, the reporters, and all the people who would eventually hear this story. Then he thought about Emma in her hospital bed and Sergeant Williams' tears. If it helps Emma and her father, then yes, I'm ready. An hour later, George stood in a small room near the guard quarters, trying on a specially modified guard uniform that had been quickly altered to fit his smaller frame. The red jacket fit perfectly, the black boots were polished to a brilliant shine, and the tall black hat sat properly on his young head. Sergeant Williams stood beside him, his own emotions barely under control as he watched the young prince prepare to take over his duties. "Your Highness, I still can't believe you're doing this for my family." "Please," George said as he adjusted his jacket. "Just call me George while we're doing this. And you don't need to thank me. This is what anyone would do for a friend." The word friend hit Sergeant Williams like a wave of warmth. In all his years of service, he had never imagined that a member of the royal family would consider him a friend. It was more honor than he had ever dreamed possible. "Now," George said, standing at attention in his new uniform, "teach me everything I need to know to protect this palace and keep everyone safe." For the next hour, Sergeant Williams carefully explained every aspect of guard duty. He showed George how to stand properly, how to hold the ceremonial rifle, how to scan for potential threats, and what to do if anyone approached with questions or concerns. "The most important thing," Sergeant Williams explained, "is to stay alert and aware of everything happening around you. Your job is to watch and protect, and to get help immediately if anything seems wrong." George listened carefully to every instruction, asking questions when he needed clarification, and practicing each movement until he felt confident. The weight of the uniform and the responsibility it represented made him feel older and more mature than his 10 years. "Remember," Sergeant Williams added, "some people might stop and stare because they'll notice you're younger than the other guards. Just stay professional and focused on your job. Don't let anything distract you from your duty." As the training session ended, Sergeant Williams looked at George with amazement and gratitude. "Are you sure you're ready for this, George?" George stood at perfect attention, his young face serious and determined. "I'm ready, Sergeant Williams. Go see Emma, and don't worry about anything here. I'll take care of everything until you get back." With tears of gratitude in his eyes, Sergeant Williams handed George the keys and radio that came with the position, and prepared to leave the palace for the first time in 3 days to see his sick daughter. George walked slowly to the guard post where this whole extraordinary day had begun, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on his young shoulders. The red uniform felt both strange and natural at the same time, and the ceremonial rifle, though lighter than the real ones used by adult guards, still represented the seriousness of his duty. As he took his position at the post, George thought about Sergeant Williams driving through London traffic toward the hospital where Emma was waiting. He imagined the guard's excitement and nervousness about seeing his daughter after 3 long days, and it made George even more determined to do his job perfectly. The first hour passed quietly. George stood perfectly still, just as Sergeant Williams had taught him, scanning the corridors and entrances with careful attention. A few palace staff members walked by, doing double takes when they noticed how young the guard looked. But George maintained his professional composure and kept his eyes focused on his duties. During the second hour, things became more interesting. A group of visiting diplomats walked through the corridor, and their security detail noticed George immediately. One of the security officers approached, clearly curious about why there was a child in a guard uniform standing at an important post. "Excuse me," the officer said politely, "but you seem quite young to be on guard duty." George remembered Sergeant Williams's instructions about staying professional no matter what happened. "I am officially assigned to this post, sir, and I am carrying out my duties as instructed." The security officer looked confused but impressed by George's serious demeanor. "Well, you certainly seem to know what you're doing. Carry on." As the diplomats passed by, George heard one of them whisper to another, "Did you see that young guard? He couldn't have been more than 10 years old, but he carried himself like a seasoned professional." George felt a surge of pride at the compliment, but he didn't let it distract him from his job. He continued to watch and observe, taking his responsibilities seriously. Near the end of his second hour, something unexpected happened that would test everything Sergeant Williams had taught him. A tourist group that had gotten separated from their official palace tour wandered into the corridor where George was standing guard. They were clearly lost and confused, and they approached George for help. "Excuse me," an elderly woman said. "We seem to have gotten turned around. Can you tell us how to get back to the main tour route?" George knew that helping lost visitors was part of a guard's duties, but he also knew that he shouldn't leave his post. He quickly pressed the button on his radio to signal for assistance, just as Sergeant Williams had taught him. "Please wait here for just a moment," George told the tourist politely. "I've called for someone to help you get back to your tour group." Within minutes, a palace staff member arrived to guide the lost tourists back to safety. As they left, George heard the elderly woman tell her husband, "What a polite and helpful young man. The palace certainly trains their guards well, regardless of age." George smiled slightly at the compliment, feeling proud that he had handled the situation correctly without abandoning his post or failing in his duties. As his third hour began, George started to understand why Sergeant Williams and the other guards took their job so seriously. Standing guard wasn't just about looking important in a fancy uniform. It was about being responsible for the safety and security of one of the most important buildings in the country, and about serving something bigger than yourself. The rain that had been falling when this adventure began finally stopped, and sunlight began streaming through the palace windows. George took it as a good sign, hoping that it meant Emma was feeling better, and that Sergeant Williams was having a wonderful visit with his daughter. Just as George was thinking about how much he had learned during his time as a guard, he saw a familiar figure walking quickly down the corridor toward him. Sergeant Williams had returned from the hospital, and the expression on his face was completely different from when he had left. The guard's eyes were bright with happiness instead of tears. His shoulders were straight with renewed energy, and he was walking with the confident step of a man whose world had just become right again. "George," Sergeant Williams called out softly as he approached. "I'm back." George maintained his position until Sergeant Williams was close enough for a quiet conversation. "How is Emma? Is she feeling better?" "She's much better," Sergeant Williams replied, his voice filled with joy and relief. "The doctors say she's going to be fine, and seeing her father made her feel so much stronger. She was so excited when I told her about what you did for us today." George felt a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the uniform he was wearing. Knowing that he had helped reunite a father and daughter during a scary time made every minute of standing guard feel worthwhile. As Sergeant Williams prepared to resume his duties, he carefully helped George remove the guard uniform and return to his regular clothes. The transformation back from guard to prince felt strange to George, who had spent the last 3 hours feeling like a completely different person. "George," Sergeant Williams said as he folded the small uniform with reverent care, "what you did today will never be forgotten by me or my family. Emma wants to meet you someday if that would be possible." "I would love to meet Emma," George replied sincerely. "Maybe when she's feeling completely better she could come visit the palace. I could show her around and tell her about what it's really like to live here." The guard's eyes filled with tears of gratitude once again. She would be over the moon with joy. "Thank you, Your Highness. Thank you for everything." As George walked back through the palace corridors toward his father's study, he reflected on the incredible day he had just experienced. Standing guard had taught him things about responsibility, duty, and service that no classroom lesson ever could. But more importantly, it had taught him about the power of compassion and the difference one person could make in another's life. When George entered his father's study, Prince William looked up from his papers with a mixture of pride and curiosity on his face. "How did it go, son?" "It was amazing, Father. I learned so much about what it really means to serve others. And Sergeant Williams got to see Emma. She's going to be okay." Prince William stood up and walked over to his son, placing a gentle hand on George's shoulder. "I'm very proud of you, George. What you did today showed real leadership and compassion. Those are the qualities that will make you a great prince and someday a great king. Father, do you think what we did today was right, even though it broke the rules?" Prince William smiled and sat down so he could look directly into George's eyes. "George, there are rules and traditions that exist for good reasons, and we should always respect them. But there are also times when doing the right thing is more important than following the rules. Today was one of those times. Will people be upset about what I did? Some people might be surprised or even confused," Prince William admitted. "But I think most people will understand that what you did came from a place of love and kindness. And those are never the wrong reasons for action." Over the following days, word of George's extraordinary act of service began to spread throughout the palace staff and eventually to the world beyond the palace walls. News of the young prince who had stepped aside from his privileged position to help a father see his sick child touched hearts across the globe. Letters and emails poured into the palace from people who had heard the story, praising George for his compassion and maturity. Parents wrote about how they had shared the story with their own children as an example of how to help others. Teachers used it in their classrooms to discuss the importance of kindness and service. But the most meaningful response came from a small, handwritten note delivered to George a week later. The letter was written in careful, childish handwriting and decorated with drawings of flowers and hearts. "Dear Prince George," the letter read, "My name is Emma Williams. My daddy told me about how you stood guard so he could come see me in the hospital. You are the nicest prince in the whole world. I drew you a picture of us being friends. Thank you for helping my daddy when he was sad. I hope we can meet someday and I can show you my other drawings. Love, Emma." George treasured Emma's letter more than any official commendation or formal recognition he might ever receive. It reminded him of why he had made his choice that rainy day. And it reinforced the lesson his grandmother had taught him about using privilege to serve others. Months later, when Emma had fully recovered and was healthy and strong again, she did indeed visit the palace. George gave her a personal tour, showed her the guard post where her father worked, and even let her try on a small version of the guard uniform. As they walked through the grand corridors together, Emma looked up at George with admiration and said, "My daddy says you're going to be a wonderful king someday." George smiled and replied, "I hope so, Emma. And if I am, it will be because people like you and your father taught me what really matters." The story of the day Prince George stepped aside from his royal privileges to stand guard became a defining moment in his young life, shaping the man and leader he would eventually become. It reminded everyone who heard it that true nobility comes not from titles or positions, but from the courage to do what is right, especially when it means putting the needs of others before your own comfort or convenience. And in a quiet corner of Buckingham Palace, Sergeant Williams continued his faithful service, standing a little taller and serving with even greater dedication, knowing that he worked in a place where compassion and humanity were valued above all the ancient traditions and protocols in the world.